Vanakkam. Welcome to this course on classics in neuroscience. In this video and in the videos that are going to follow, we will start our discussion on the physiology of the action potential. What is the action part of the action potential and how was it discovered? What were the historical contexts that led to the discovery of the mechanisms of the action potential? All the things we will discuss in this video and in the next 4, 5, 5, 6 videos. So, in this video we will be looking at the historical journey or the historical context of nerve impulses and what is the impact or what is the importance of nerve impulses for psychology. So, the nervous system, different parts of the nervous system are connected through long axons. A critical property of an axon is that it is an excitable membrane. That is, it can maintain a steady potential difference across its membrane, that is one, and it can support a wave of potential difference travelling along its length. So, this is the reason why these axons are called excitable membranes, those with excitable membranes. How this propagation happens? Through this mechanism, through this method called action potentials. So, without this action potentials, there will be no sensation. So, we cannot sense things. So, what we see, what we taste, what we smell, what we touch and what we hear. There is no sensation, there is no perception, there is no behavior, there is no movement, there is nothing. So, everything practically comes about, all this sensation and also motor actions comes about because of these action potentials. So, what exactly is the mechanism underlying this action potential will be the subject of discussion in this video and in the next few videos. So, initially in ancient Greece, it was thought that communication happens through the flow of fluids or some specific liquids, spirits, spirit as in the fluid, not spirit as in ghost, spirit as in the fluid that flows from one part of the brain to another part of the brain or to another part of the body. These fluids are the ones that are communicating information, it was thought in ancient Greece. Somehow it is not clear how this was accepted for a long time, but this was the view of ancient Greece. In the 18th century, in 1791, for the first time, Luigi Galvani of Bologna in Italy discovered and demonstrated a form of electricity, what he called as animal electricity in frog muscles. That is, there are electrical impulses travelling through frog nerves and frog muscles, was discovered and demonstrated for the first time. So, this gave rise to the idea that maybe this kind of electric conduction is not just restricted to animals, but also to higher animals like humans, but maybe also to plants. It was, people were beginning to think like that. In the meanwhile, in 1819, Hans Ørsted, he discovered the electromagnetic effect, essentially leading to the industrial use of electricity. In the 1840s, Carlo Matteucci and Emile Dubois-Raymond started to use the galvanometer, which was essentially an instrument to measure small currents. There are different forms of this galvanometer, all of us have used this in high school. So, Carlo Matteucci and Emile Dubois-Raymond started using galvanometer to study electrophysiology. And in the late 19th century, all German physiologists, a large number of German physiologists decided that they will push to make physiology a basic science similar to physics or chemistry with more detailed and mechanistic description of physiology. So, they were keen on making physiology the physics of the biological system, something of that sort. In other words, they were interested in making physiology so good and so explanatory that it can be compared with physics. In 1888, Walter Nernst developed the so called Nernst equation, which described the potential difference that must exist for a given ion to not make movement across that semi-permeable membrane. The details of this I am leaving for want of time, but I have described this in a previous video in a different course, the Nernst equation video, which my teaching assistants will share with you through YouTube description and through forums. In the early 20th century, Julius Bernstein suggested that there is a resting membrane potential and an action potential, essentially two different phases. That at rest there is a membrane potential and during action there is a potential which he called as resting membrane potential and action potential. And later people measured action potential in many organisms, small organisms starting with frog. In the mid 20th century, advancements in electrical measurements, instrumentation, electronics and amplification and microelectrode development, a whole bunch of things developed. Due to all these things led to a mechanistic explanation of the action potential. So, this is like a broad overview, broad history of how nerve impulses or action potentials came to be. So, if you see the work of Julius Bernstein, he suggested that the inside of the cell is more negative than the outside. And because why would this be the case? Because it contains more anions than cations. So, there are ions everywhere inside the cell and outside the cell. The inside of the cell contains perhaps more anions than cations. And action potential itself happens due to a transient change in the resting membrane potential. So, what happens is that for a very brief amount of time there is a sudden change in the resting membrane potential of the cell. This was a explanation given by Julius Bernstein. Around the same year, William Overton suggested that the action potential was due to specific changes in sodium and potassium currents. Very insightful comment, very insightful observation to come in this as early as 1900s. But somehow this was not given due weightage for the next few decades. Somehow this was overlooked, somehow it was missed. So, Hermann observed as early as 1874, for example, that action potential propagation happens through local circuits. Propagation was through local circuits, and those currents that spread passively, essentially those potentials that do not cross the threshold, called as subthreshold potentials now. These subthreshold potentials spread passively. These were called as, in the good old days, these were called as electrotonic potentials. Later they came to be called as graded potentials. I will share with you videos of what constitutes graded potential and what constitutes action potential, the exact mechanism of action potential, the details of this through my previous recordings in the other course, in the neuroscience of human movements course. So, meanwhile, Lord Kelvin suggested that that the neuron and its conduction properties were similar to cable, electric cables. So, neuronal conduction was studied using the cable properties, for example. Of course, this was not just found only in animals, was also found in plants. For example, the Venus flytrap is a plant that is an insectivorous plant that just closes its petals when the insect gets inside, when it catches the prey. That was also shown to exhibit action potentials. But if electricity is getting conducted through nerves like in cables, is it getting conducted instantaneously like electrons are flowing through an electric cable? The answer is no. It is fast, but not that fast. So, when nerve impulse was measured in frogs, it was found that it travels at a speed of 40 meters per second. So, it is not that fast. This suggested the idea that nerve conduction was not instantaneous like it happens in cables, electric cables. Maybe it is not a physical mechanism, but rather a complex biological process that causes these action potential or nerve impulses, leading to this at that time yet unknown concept of the action potential. So, just like heart pumps blood, kidney filters out waste into urine, and likewise the nerve cell or the neuron conducts electricity processes and conducts information, transmits information through action potential. So, it is a property of the system. So, in the 19th century, measurements and description of the action potential was severely challenged by technological development. So, there was no sensitive equipment, or equipment were not sensitive enough to catch, to detect and measure nerve impulses or action potentials. So, there was a lack of this. The string galvanometer became available. This allowed indirect measurement of nerve activity, but there are some limitations. That is, if you keep a galvanometer, because it was very sensitive to vibrations, if it was kept on a light table, because the earth is always moving, because the buildings are always moving, there is always some vibration. So, you need to have very heavy tables in which you can keep the galvanometer, sometimes tons heavy. The tables may be as heavy as several tons, so that the artifacts of table movements are avoided. This is still a challenge. Then the question of how does this description of nerve impulse affect our understanding of psychology? The description of nerve impulse and action potential affect our understanding of psychology, because the idea that you can do things as fast as you think is perhaps wrong, right? Because for you to execute something, it takes time, but for you to think about that thing, it takes much less time. The idea that the mind is different from the soul, or the mind is different from the body, or the soul is different from the body, for example, this dualism described by Descartes, for example, exhibits or manifests here. I am able to think about something very fast, but to do the same thing it takes much more time, because execution will have to happen through a mechanical apparatus which is a body. It takes time. So, this again, this dualism manifests itself here, perhaps due to the limited speed at which the nerve impulses or action potentials travel. One of the consequences is this. With this we come to the end of this video. In this video we looked at the historical journey of nerve impulses, that is, we looked at the historical background of nerve impulses and the action potentials, and what the discovery or description of nerve impulse and action potential means for the field of psychology. Thank you very much for your attention.